3 centuries of institutional excellence had transformed the Meridian Defense Institute into the galaxy's premier officer training facility. Though this distinction came with the minor caveat that graduation required surviving experiences specifically designed to break the spirits of beings whose ancestors had never encountered anything more dangerous than a philosophical disagreement. The institution's crown jewel, the infamous Survival Protocols examination, had been designed by committees of beings whose idea of physical exertion involved lifting a datapad with 2 tentacles instead of 1. Located on Zephyr Prime, a moon so perfectly climate-controlled that seasonal variation consisted of adjusting the artificial aurora from pleasantly purple to serenely silver, the Academy represented everything the Galactic Military Consortium valued. Order, predictability, and the comforting illusion that warfare could be reduced to theoretical models and statistical probability. Faculty, drawn from 12 different species across the inner spiral, shared a collective belief that intelligence trumped all other attributes, a philosophy that worked wonderfully until someone decided to admit a human. Cadet Kira Voss from Terra 3 had arrived at the Academy through what administrators generously termed diversity quotas, and what everyone else recognized as bureaucratic oversight. The consortium's integration policies demanded representation from Deathworld species, though the fine print clearly indicated this was meant to be symbolic rather than functional. Humans, those peculiar bipedal creatures from the Outer Rim territories, were classified somewhere between exotic curiosity and liability insurance nightmare. The morning of her Survival Protocols examination found Kira standing in Formation Hall Alpha 7, surrounded by her fellow cadets who maintained what they considered a respectful distance. Rixtor, a crystalline Zelani whose species communicated primarily through harmonic resonance, had positioned himself 3 meters away after discovering that humans produced what he termed chaotic vibrations simply by existing. Mentikar, representing the aquatic Thalassians, had arrived in her environmental suit filled with precisely pH-balanced saline, her gill slits fluttering nervously whenever Kira moved too quickly. The most amusing specimen was Quinn Delta, a cerebra whose enlarged cranium housed a brain that could calculate hyperspace trajectories while composing poetry in 17 languages simultaneously. This impressive intellectual capacity apparently didn't extend to understanding why a creature that evolved dodging predatory megafauna might not be impressed by academic challenges designed to test beings whose ancestors had never encountered anything more dangerous than a strongly worded diplomatic protest. "Today's evaluation," announced Commander Thexnell, his insectoid frame clicking with what passed for authority among the Vorthak, "will separate those destined for leadership from those better suited to logistical support roles." His compound eyes swept across the assembled cadets, lingering on Kira with the expression of someone who'd found something unpleasant on his shoe. The Survival Protocols examination has been administered to over 14,000 cadets. The average completion time is 27 minutes and 36 seconds. He paused, mandibles twitching in what might have been satisfaction. The failure rate stands at 12%, primarily among species from worlds classified as Class 3 or lower on the Galactic Habitability Index. Another meaningful glance at Kira, whose homeworld's classification had required inventing new categories below the existing scale. The testing facility occupied the Academy's sub-basement level, a location chosen for its symbolic value as much as its practical benefits. Candidates descended through progressively reinforced corridors, passing plaques commemorating previous record holders and memorial dedications to those who'd required psychological rehabilitation afterward. The walls themselves told the story of institutional evolution, starting with decorative panels depicting abstract representations of courage and determination, gradually transitioning to increasingly specific warnings about proper hydration, emergency medical procedures, and the importance of indicating surrender before permanent damage occurred. The testing chamber, Epsilon 12, had been constructed according to specifications that read like a collaboration between paranoid security engineers and sadistic architects. The detention cell measured precisely 4 meters by 3 meters by 2.7 meters high, dimensions calculated to accommodate the largest known sapient species while providing insufficient space for effective movement. The walls consisted of reinforced durasteel composite rated to withstand direct antimatter bombardment, primarily because the consortium's insurance providers had insisted on it after reviewing casualty reports from earlier testing protocols. Security systems included biometric scanners, quantum encryption locks, gravitational field generators, and what the technical manuals euphemistically described as behavioral modification incentives. The monitoring equipment could track individual heartbeats, analyze stress hormones, and detect escape attempts down to the molecular level. Previous successful completions had involved elaborate technical solutions: electromagnetic pulse generation, systematic weakness analysis, complex social engineering of the automated systems, and in one memorable case, the construction of what was essentially a pocket-sized particle accelerator, using components salvaged from the cell's own monitoring equipment. The Academy's instructors took considerable pride in their facility's sophistication, frequently noting that it had been updated 17 times, following incidents involving species whose problem-solving approaches hadn't quite aligned with the intended parameters. The Vorthak enhancement had introduced redundant locking mechanisms, after Cadet Quetzal had simply dissolved the original magnetic locks with secreted acid. The ethereal modification had added psychic dampening fields following the incident with Cadet Ythmara, whose telepathic abilities had convinced the security system that she was actually a maintenance technician coming to fix a non-existent malfunction. What the designers hadn't anticipated, despite 3 centuries of experience with galactic diversity, was encountering a species that looked at sophisticated technological solutions and asked, "But what if I just hit it really hard?" Commander Thexnell gestured toward the observation deck, where faculty members and advanced cadets had gathered to witness what most expected to be an educational demonstration of human limitations. The viewing area resembled a theater designed by beings who'd never quite grasped the concept of comfortable seating, featuring angular benches and adjustable atmospheric controls that accommodated everything from methane-breathing crystalline entities to creatures requiring precisely controlled electromagnetic fields to maintain consciousness. "Cadet Voss," Thixanel announced, his translator rendering his clicking speech into standard galactic with mechanical precision. "You have 30 minutes to escape from testing chamber Epsilon 12. The evaluation begins when the primary door seals. Failure to complete the task within the allotted time frame will result in automatic extraction and remedial training assignment." Kira nodded, her expression suggesting the same level of concern one might feel when asked to retrieve something from the next room. She walked toward the chamber entrance, her gait displaying the loose-limbed confidence that made her fellow cadets nervous and the faculty deeply suspicious. Humans moved like predators even when they were simply going to lunch, a fact that had inspired several academic papers on the psychological implications of evolutionary history. The chamber door sealed with the sort of elaborate mechanical precision that announced its own importance, multiple layers of barriers engaging in sequence while status displays confirmed system activation. Somewhere in the facility's depths, monitoring equipment began recording biometric data, tracking everything from brain activity to the rate of cellular metabolism. The observation deck's primary screen activated, showing the chamber's interior through multiple camera angles, while diagnostic readouts provided real-time analysis of environmental conditions, security status, and the subject's physiological state. Kira stood in the center of the cell, slowly turning to examine her surroundings with the methodical attention of someone taking inventory. Her hands moved to test the walls, pressing against various surfaces with what appeared to be casual curiosity. The monitoring equipment registered elevated tactile contact but detected no signs of panic, frustration, or the elaborate planning phases that typically preceded successful escape attempts. "Interesting approach," murmured Director Zilandra Keth, her ethereal form flickering slightly as she focused her attention on the displays. "Most candidates begin with systematic analysis of the security systems. Deathworlder methodology tends toward the primitive," Thexnell replied, compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lighting. "Brute force approaches rarely succeed against properly engineered containment systems. The betting pools among the advanced cadets had established odds strongly favoring failure, with most speculation centering on how long the human would spend attempting increasingly desperate technological solutions before accepting defeat. Rixthor had wagered she would attempt to short-circuit the electronic locks by somehow generating static electricity, while Mentika predicted an elaborate attempt to flood the chamber using the climate control systems. What actually happened defied every prediction, probability model, and assumption about rational problem-solving approaches. Kira had completed her examination of the chamber in approximately 45 seconds, a time frame that barely registered on monitoring equipment calibrated for much longer analysis phases. Rather than approaching the sophisticated door mechanisms, the quantum encryption systems, or the carefully designed security vulnerabilities that allowed for elegant technical solutions, she walked directly to the chamber's rear wall. She placed both hands against the Durasteel composite surface, pressed her shoulder against it, and began to push. The monitoring equipment registered increasing stress readings from the wall itself, structural sensors detecting force applications that fell well outside normal parameters. Kira's biometric readings remained stable, showing the sort of controlled exertion one might associate with moderate exercise rather than desperate escape attempts. "What exactly is she doing?" Director Keth asked, her translucent features betraying confusion. "Apparently," Security Chief Brontash replied, his gravelly voice carrying notes of disbelief, "she's trying to push through a wall rated to withstand antimatter bombardment." The absurdity of the statement hung in the observation deck's recycled atmosphere like an accusation against rational thought itself. Beings who could calculate hyperspace trajectories while composing symphonies found themselves watching a creature from a backwater Deathworld attempt to solve an engineering problem through what could only be described as applied stubbornness. The wall began to crack, not the elegant, systematic failure that engineers anticipated from properly applied stress analysis, but irregular fractures spreading outward from the point where Kira's hands pressed against the surface. The Durasteel composite, designed to distribute force across its entire structure, was encountering a type of loading it had never been intended to handle. Localized, sustained pressure applied by something that refused to acknowledge that the task was impossible. Alarm systems activated throughout the facility, emergency protocols engaging, as structural sensors reported readings that violated several fundamental assumptions about materials science. The chamber's environmental systems registered atmospheric pressure changes as microscopic fizzes allowed air to escape into spaces that weren't supposed to exist. "This is not possible," Thexanel stated, his translator struggling with the emotional overtones of Vorthak clicking that had no equivalent in standard galactic. "Apparently," Kira replied, her voice carrying clearly through the monitoring systems. "Nobody told the wall that." The fractures widened, spreading across the surface in patterns that resembled abstract art created by someone with a very specific grudge against structural integrity. Chunks of Durasteel composite began to separate from the main wall, falling to the chamber floor with metallic clangs that the monitoring systems recorded with bewildered precision. 90 seconds into the 30-minute evaluation, Cadet Kira Voss created a hole large enough to walk through. She stepped through the opening she'd created, emerging into a maintenance corridor that wasn't supposed to be accessible from the testing chamber, brushing dust from her uniform with the casual gesture of someone who'd just completed a routine task. Behind her, the sophisticated security systems continued to function perfectly. Quantum locks engaged, biometric scanners active, gravitational field generators maintaining their assigned parameters, all of them protecting a chamber that now featured an unscheduled architectural modification. The silence in the observation deck carried the weight of fundamental assumptions being systematically dismantled. Beings whose civilizations had mastered faster than sight travel, energy manipulation, and consciousness transfer found themselves unable to process what they'd witnessed. The human had ignored every sophisticated solution in favor of an approach so primitive it predated their species' discovery of metallurgy. "How?" Director Keth whispered, her ethereal form flickering with what might have been the galactic equivalent of existential crisis. "Is that possible?" "Well," Kira's voice came through the communication system as she located the maintenance corridor's exit. "The wall was designed to distribute force evenly across its surface, which works great against explosions or energy weapons. But if you apply sustained pressure to a small area, eventually the molecular bonds start to fail. Basic materials science, really." She paused, apparently considering whether further explanation was necessary. "Also, humans are stronger than you think we are. Our homeworld has gravity about 4 times what most of you consider normal, and we evolved chasing down animals that could run faster than your ground vehicles. This was just pushing against a wall until it broke." The chronometer displayed her total escape time, 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Commander Thexnell stared at the readings, his compound eyes unable to focus on numbers that seemed to mock everything he understood about military evaluation procedures. The wall was rated for antimatter bombardment. Sure, Kira agreed. Her footsteps echoing through the maintenance corridor, she made her way toward the facility's main level. But antimatter explosions happened fast. I had as much time as I needed. The maintenance corridor's exit opened into the Academy's primary corridor system, where Kira emerged looking slightly dusty, but otherwise unaffected by her experience. She walked back toward the testing facility's main entrance, her stride displaying the same relaxed confidence that had characterized her approach to the evaluation. Behind her, emergency repair crews were already scrambling toward testing chamber Epsilon 12, their equipment designed to handle routine maintenance rather than structural reconstruction projects. Early damage assessments suggested that repairing the chamber would require completely rebuilding the rear wall, upgrading the monitoring systems to account for previously inconceivable failure modes, and somehow explaining to the consortium's insurance providers why their antimatter-proof the facility had been breached by someone pushing it with their hands. The observation deck had devolved into what could charitably be described as controlled chaos. Faculty members from 12 different species found themselves engaged in urgent discussions about whether the evaluation results were valid, whether the testing methodology required fundamental revision, or whether they needed to completely reconsider their understanding of Deathworld species capabilities. The regulations, Thexnor muttered, reviewing his datapad with increasing desperation, don't actually specify that candidates must use the door. The wall wasn't supposed to be vulnerable to that type of attack, Security Chief Brontash added, his gravelly voice carrying notes of professional embarrassment. Our structural analysis didn't account for sustained localized pressure applied by whatever that was. A human being moderately annoyed by inconvenient architecture, Kira supplied helpfully as she rejoined the group. Is there anything else you need me to demonstrate, or can I get back to my regular classes? Director Keth's ethereal form had stabilized somewhat, though she continued to flicker occasionally as her consciousness processed the implications of what had occurred. Cadet Voss, your approach to the evaluation was unconventional. It worked, though, Kira pointed out. Isn't that what matters in a survival situation? The question hung in the recycled atmosphere like a philosophical challenge that nobody particularly wanted to address. The survival protocol's examination had been designed to test problem-solving abilities, resourcefulness, and grace under pressure. By any objective measure, Kira had demonstrated all three qualities, albeit through methods that hadn't appeared in any of the instructional materials. The cost of repairs, Thexnor began, then stopped as his translator provided a preliminary estimate that seemed to involve more zeros than should be mathematically necessary. Probably less than you'd spend on the energy required to maintain all those security systems for 30 minutes per candidate, Kira observed. Plus, now you know the wall has a design flaw. That's valuable information. The advanced cadets, who'd established betting pools, found themselves confronting the mathematical reality that none of them had predicted the correct outcome. Rixthor's crystalline structure was resonating at frequencies that suggested profound confusion, while Mentika had retreated entirely into her environmental suit, her gill slits sealed against an atmosphere that suddenly seemed less predictable than she'd assumed. Quindelta, whose enlarged cranium housed enough computing power to manage a small starship, was staring at Kira with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation where all the variables had been replaced with interpretive data. You didn't analyze the security systems, he finally managed to say. Didn't need to, Kira replied. They weren't the problem. The problem was getting out of the room, and the wall was the most direct route. The wall was reinforced durasteel composite, rated for antimatter bombardment. Yes, you mentioned that. Kira's tone carried the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to particularly slow students. But I wasn't trying to blow it up. I was just pushing it until the molecular bonds failed. Different kind of stress entirely. The implications of her statement rippled through the observation deck like waves through a pond populated by creatures who'd never learned to swim. If Deathworld species could simply ignore sophisticated defensive systems by attacking them in ways that hadn't been anticipated, what did that mean for military installations, secure facilities, and the general assumption that advanced technology provided meaningful protection against primitive approaches? We're going to need to revise the testing protocols, Director Keth announced, her her ethereal form flickering with what might have been the galactic equivalent of a headache. Probably the entire curriculum. Thexion agreed, his compound eyes reflecting the sort of light that suggested deep philosophical contemplation. If Deathworlders can solve complex problems by simply refusing to acknowledge their complexity, it's not that simple, Kira protested, though her expression suggested she was enjoying the conversation more than she probably should. I mean, you still need to understand the problem before you can figure out how to break it. I knew the wall would fail under sustained pressure because I understand material science. I just applied that knowledge differently than you expected. The explanation didn't seem to provide the comfort the faculty had been hoping for. If anything, it suggested that Deathworld problem-solving involved the same intellectual processes as conventional approaches, but with the addition of what could only be described as a fundamental disrespect for the assumptions underlying galactic civilization. Emergency repair crews had reached testing chamber Epsilon 12 and were reporting back with updates that seemed to grow more alarming with each transmission. The hole in the rear wall was clean-edged and precise, suggesting controlled structural failure rather than chaotic destruction. More disturbing, preliminary analysis indicated that the failure point had been exactly where anyone with basic materials engineering knowledge would have predicted, assuming they'd considered applying sustained localized pressure to a composite structure designed to handle distributed force loads. The human was right about the molecular bonds, one of the repair technicians reported, his voice carrying the sort of professional resignation that suggested expensive revelations. The composite was never designed to handle that type of stress application. Honestly, it's surprising nobody thought to test for this failure mode. Because, Security Chief Brontash replied with admirable restraint, nobody imagined that a candidate would try to push through a wall with their bare hands. Why not? Kira asked, genuine curiosity evident in her voice. I mean, if you're trapped somewhere and you need to get out, you try the most direct approach available. The door was complicated, but the wall was just a barrier. Barriers can be broken if you apply enough force in the right way. The casual tone with which she described demolishing military-grade construction materials suggested a worldview that the Academy's faculty were only beginning to comprehend. Humans, apparently, lived in an environment where barriers can be broken was considered basic common sense, rather than an engineering challenge requiring sophisticated analysis and specialized equipment. Your homeworld, Director Keth inquired delicately, is classified as uninhabitable by consortium standards. Terra 3? Yeah, it's pretty rough, Kira agreed. Gravity's heavy, weather's unpredictable, and most of the native wildlife considers humans a convenient protein source. But that's just normal for us. We adapted. Adapted how? Got stronger, got smarter, got better at breaking things that tried to stop us? Kira shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to convey the entire evolutionary history of a species that had learned to thrive in conditions that would kill most galactic citizens within hours. It's not complicated, you just do whatever works. The phrase, whatever works, seemed to echo through the observation deck with ominous implications. If Deathworld species approached problems with the assumption that conventional solutions were merely starting points rather than authoritative limitations, what other fundamental assumptions about galactic society might require revision? We'll need to implement new security protocols, Thexnell muttered, his translator struggling with emotional undertones that suggested the Vorthak equivalent of an existential crisis. Enhanced structural reinforcement, alternative containment methodologies, perhaps gravitational suppression fields to limit physical capabilities, or, Kira suggested helpfully, you could just ask candidates not to break the walls. Most people are pretty reasonable about that sort of thing. The suggestion that military security could be maintained through polite requests rather than technological sophistication seemed to violate several principles of civilized society, though nobody present could immediately articulate exactly which ones. The concept of honor-based containment had appeared in historical texts describing primitive societies, but applying it to advanced military training seemed like proposing to navigate hyperspace using a magnetic compass. The examination results, Director Keth announced after several minutes of contemplative silence, are obviously valid. Cadet Voss completed the escape scenario well within the allocated timeframe, using methods that, while unconventional, demonstrate clear understanding of both the problem and available solutions. Does this mean I pass? Kira asked. You've achieved the highest score in the evaluation's recorded history, Thexnell replied, his compound eyes reflecting what might have been grudging respect. "Though we'll need to establish new categories for future documentation purposes." The advanced cadets who'd witnessed the demonstration found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about Deathworld species, military strategy, and the fundamental nature of problem-solving itself. Rixthor's crystalline structure had shifted to frequencies that suggested philosophical enlightenment, while Mentika had emerged from her environmental suit to observe Kira with something approaching professional admiration. Quinn Delta, whose enlarged cranium usually provided solutions to any conceptual challenge, was still struggling with the mathematical implications of ignoring sophisticated systems in favor of direct action. "But the probability calculations," he protested weakly. "The structural analysis, the force distribution models, the material stress coefficient are correct, I'm sure," Kira agreed. "But sometimes the simple answer is the right answer. The wall was in my way, so I moved it." "You didn't move it," Security Chief Bruntash pointed out. "You destroyed it." Same result though, the wall stopped being a problem. Emergency repair crews were submitting cost estimates that seemed to require scientific notation for proper expression. Rebuilding testing chamber Epsilon 12 would involve not only structural reconstruction, but also fundamental redesign of the containment systems, monitoring equipment, and safety protocols. The insurance claims alone would require creating new categories of coverage for acts of Deathworlder. More significantly, the Academy's administration found itself confronting the possibility that their entire approach to military education might require comprehensive revision. If candidates could solve complex challenges by simply refusing to acknowledge conventional limitations, what did that mean for tactical training, strategic planning, and the general assumption that warfare followed predictable patterns? "We'll need to establish new protocols for Deathworld cadets," Director Keth announced, her ethereal form stabilizing as she processed the implications. "Enhanced structural standards, alternative valuation methodologies, perhaps specialized training programs that account for unconventional problem-solving approaches." "What if you just made the tests more interesting?" Kira suggested. "I mean, instead of trying to make them impossible to break, design them so breaking them is part of the solution. Work with Deathworlder psychology instead of against it." The concept of collaborative testing design seemed almost revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than viewing Deathworld approaches as problems to be contained, the Academy could potentially incorporate them as features to be utilized. Military organizations throughout the galaxy had always struggled with predictable enemy tactics. Forces that could think outside conventional parameters might provide significant strategic advantages. "Kleiter Voss," Thexnell said formally, his clicking speech carrying notes of what might have been the Vorthak equivalent of career opportunity. "Would you be interested in consulting on curriculum development? We may require expertise in unconventional tactical methodologies." "Sure," Kira replied, "though you should probably fix the wall first. And maybe warn the next batch of candidates that pushing through barriers is an acceptable solution. Seems only fair." The observation deck gradually emptied as faculty members dispersed to begin the complex process of explaining to their respective departments why fundamental assumptions about military testing would require immediate revision. Advanced cadets returned to their regular schedules, though many would spend the remainder of the academic term re-evaluating their approaches to problem-solving and wondering what other impossible challenges might yield to sufficiently direct applications of force. Emergency repair crews continued their work in testing chamber Epsilon 12, where they discovered that human-created structural damage followed different patterns than conventional engineering failures. The hole in the rear wall was precise, clean-edged, and somehow more aesthetically pleasing than the sophisticated door mechanisms that remained completely functional, but entirely irrelevant. By the following morning, word of the evaluation had spread throughout the Academy's communication networks, gaining embellishments and interpretations that transformed a straightforward escape scenario into something approaching mythological status. Cadet Voss became known as the Wall Breaker, though she seemed to prefer her original designation, and continued attending regular classes as if demolishing military-grade construction materials was a routine academic exercise. The Galactic Military Consortium's review board received detailed reports about the incident, accompanied by cost estimates, structural analysis, and recommendations for policy revisions that would account for Deathworld capabilities in future planning. The documentation process required creating new classification categories, updating safety protocols, and somehow explaining to budget administrators why their unbreachable testing facility now resembled a construction site. 3 weeks later, testing chamber Epsilon 12 reopened with enhanced structural reinforcement, alternative containment methodologies, and a discrete plaques reading Voss Memorial Wall installed where the original barrier had once stood. The inscription noted that the memorial commemorated not destruction, but rather the triumph of practical problem-solving over theoretical limitations. Advanced cadets from subsequent classes would often pause at the memorial, contemplating the philosophical implications of a solution so direct it had never occurred to anyone as a possibility. The story became part of Academy folklore, passed down through generations of officers who would carry its lessons into conflicts where conventional thinking might prove insufficient against enemies who refused to acknowledge accepted limitations. Commander Thexnall eventually published a scholarly paper titled Deathworld Methodology in Military Applications, which became required reading at military academies throughout the galaxy. The work explored the concept that sophisticated solutions, while elegant and intellectually satisfying, were not inherently superior to approaches that simply worked effectively. Director Keth incorporated Deathworld perspectives into the Academy's strategic curriculum, establishing exchange programs with institutions on worlds classified as marginally habitable or worse. The initiative proved remarkably successful, producing officers who could adapt to unexpected situations and develop solutions that enemies trained in conventional tactics found impossible to predict or counter. Kyra Voss graduated with highest honors, her academic record noting particular excellence in applied problem-solving and unconventional tactical analysis. She accepted a commission with the Galactic Defense Force's Special Operations Division, where her ability to identify direct solutions to complex problems proved invaluable in situations where sophisticated approaches had previously failed. The Academy's testing protocols were eventually redesigned to incorporate multiple solution pathways, acknowledging that different species might approach identical challenges using methodologies that reflected their evolutionary backgrounds. The new evaluations proved more effective at identifying candidates suited for military leadership, though they also required significantly higher insurance premiums and more robust construction standards. Years later, when military historians analyzed the conflicts that shaped galactic politics during the late Consortium period, they would note the emergence of tactical approaches that combined sophisticated strategic planning with direct action methodologies. These hybrid doctrines proved remarkably effective against enemies who had prepared exclusively for conventional warfare, suggesting that diversity in problem-solving approaches provided strategic advantages that uniform thinking could never achieve. The lesson ultimately was both simple and profound. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution to a complex problem is recognizing that the problem isn't actually as complex as it appears. And sometimes, when faced with a barrier that seems impossible to overcome, the most effective approach is to push it until it breaks. After all, barriers are just things that haven't been broken yet.